The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
Florida History and Culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. St. Augustine was established in 1565 as the first continuously occupied European settlement in what is now the United States. Just 2 miles north of here, Fort Mose was built in 1738 as the first legally sanctioned free black community.
3 years ago, I'd never heard of it. And I grew up, graduated high school in Florida. And I never heard of Fort Mose or free black settlement in North America. So it's history. And it actually was a forgotten history, because some of the local people who grew up in St. Augustine used to tell people when they came to town, hey, you know what, there was actually a black fort here. And no one believed them. No one was like, nah. You know, things get old after a while, and that's just rumors, or that's just stuff you hear old people say. But it was actually found to be true. And then that's why it was important to establish this, because now it's history. Now it's not just hearsay. Now it's not rumors.
This story is an incredibly important story to all of American history, and it's something that no one knows about. It's very under-recognized and understudied, and yet it was the first free black settlement in North America. And people from the English colonies to the north were escaping to the south and making their way to Spanish Florida, where they found religious sanctuary and freedom. So it's an amazing story of freedom and self-determination, people against all odds really creating a life for themselves that was an amazing thing and not well understood by history.
Fort Mose was established by decree by Governor Montiano in 1738 that any the freedom seekers who were making their way down from the Carolinas, escaping slavery, if they made it down to Spanish Florida, they could live free here at the site of Fort Mose. Now, the requirements to live free here at Mose was for the able-bodied men to join the militia and help defend the city from the north, and that all the inhabitants of Mose embrace the religion of Spain, which was the Catholic religion. That was a small price to pay for your freedom.
But also there were Native Americans here as well, because the name Gracia Real de Santa Teresa basically means in the name of the king, the patron saint Santa Teresa, and Mose being a place name, because this location out here was known as Mose, and it was settled by Native Americans from the interior of Florida who had come to St. Augustine after the siege of 1702.
I first learned about Fort Mose when I was a student at the University of Florida in the early 1970s, and one of my professors, Charles Fairbanks, was very interested in learning more about Fort Mose, and I was a student on one of the digs he brought over here to St. Augustine to try and locate it.
Deegan built on the work of Fairbanks, leading her own excavations at the Fort Mose site in the mid-1980s. She was able to conclusively identify the location of the fort on an island in the middle of a wet, marshy area.
It is an area that is hard to work in because it's in the middle of a marsh, and much of the marsh area has been dredged, so you couldn't exactly walk there, and you couldn't really take a vehicle of any kind. But for some reason, the dredging in this area managed to leave the spot where the fort itself is intact, and we've often wondered if those 19th century earth movers had a sense that that's where the fort was. But for archaeologists, it was a matter of putting on your high boots and slogging through the mud, and we had a lot of students out there. We issued them all their black rubber boots. And once you're on the actual site itself, which is a small marsh island here behind me, it is high ground. We learned that the site actually has been occupied by people for hundreds and hundreds of years. There was a prehistoric Timucua Indian site there, and then very briefly there was an Appalachian mission after 1704, and then Fort Mose. And so once you're on the site, it's normal excavation, digging through shell and dirt and tree roots.
Deegan and her team were able to provide context for the discoveries that they made on the small marsh island north of St. Augustine, proving that they had uncovered the site of Fort Mose.
A lot of the archaeological work at Fort Mose actually was oriented toward the architecture. It was necessary for us to show that this was in fact Fort Mose. And so it was really exciting to us when we were able to plot the moat and dig and locate where the moat itself for the fort was in several places, and it really had to be Fort Mose. The artifacts were of the right time period. There weren't a lot of artifacts, but they were all really interesting. Some things you would associate with soldiers, uniform buttons, lots of rum bottles, tobacco pipes, and things you'd associate with family life. Thimbles and pins, buttons, pottery for cooking, pottery for eating. And it was just, I think, an exciting process to suddenly realize, yes, this is the site of the place that there's been so much controversy about. And where was it? Did it really exist? Was even, the thinking in some ways.
The Fort Mose Historical Society was created in 1996 as a citizen support organization to assist the Florida Park Service to develop the site and tell the story of Fort Mose through interactive exhibits.
Well, at that time, there was nothing here. It was just bushes and trees, and there was an old beat-up house on this property. But with the help of St. Johns County, the city of St. Augustine, and the Florida State Park Service, which is a kind of a truly a united effort, multi-governmental agency directive, kind of put together this museum and park to really keep the story of Fort Mose alive.
Darcy McMahon from the Florida Museum of Natural Science helped archaeologist Kathleen Deegan to develop exhibits for the museum at the Fort Mose Historic State Park Visitor Center.
The thing about the settlement at Fort Mose, it was very ephemeral. It didn't last for too long, and the people didn't have a lot of material wealth. So there actually wasn't much in the way of physical stuff. There were really evocative things, small bits and pieces of daily life, like a thimble and sewing pins and smoking pipes, wine bottles, gun flints, musket balls, but really just a very modest amount of material came out of the site.
People of African descent have been an integral part of Florida history from even before the Spanish colonial period. All of the Spanish ships that came to Florida in the 16th century had black people on board, and not all of them were slaves.
People of African descent have been coming to Florida and part of Florida since it was known to exist in Europe. Ponce de Leon had free black sailors and soldiers with him. There were probably black soldiers with, or sailors at least, with Pedro Menendez. We know that immediately he rescued a lot of the captives from shipwrecks, particularly in South Florida, and among them were a number of African heritage or mixed blood mulatto people. And they had been here even before Menendez. And it's sort of interesting to think about the capture of all of these shipwreck victims over the years before Florida was settled, because not all of the first slaves here were black. Most of them, in fact, were white, but they were slaves of the Calusa and the Timucua.
As depicted in this historic reenactment, Fort Mose was established in 1738 by Manuel Montillano, governor of Spanish colonial Florida.
I charge these men and women to faithfully serve our Lord and King and our Holy Mother Church. I also appoint Captain Francisco Menendez for his courage, honor, and faithful service to be the leader of this pueblo of Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, and charge him under the rule of Crown and Church with its care. I adjure him to valiantly defend this pueblo of Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose against the enemies of the Word of God, the Crown of the King, and the little children of Mose. Viva Santa Teresa de Mose! Viva! Viva el Rey!
Viva!
I will now ask Captain Menendez of the Fort Mose Militia to say a few words.
We here at the Fort Mose Militia accepts the King's charge, and we promise to fight to the last drop of our blood to protect Fort Mose and St. Augustine.
And we would now ask our chaplain to say a few words of invocation.
Queridos hermanos y hermanas, bienvenidos aquí a Fort Mose. Brothers and sisters, we welcome you to Fort Mose. Please bow your heads and pray for God's blessing. Dominus vobiscum,
et cum spiritu tuo,
benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater, et Filius, et Spiritus Sancto.
Amen.
Procediamo in pace.
In nomine Christi.
The Spanish government in Florida encouraged slaves from the British colonies to the north to run away. The British slaves were granted freedom in Florida as long as they promised to defend the colony against attack and converted to Catholicism.
They were getting runaways from the Carolinas that came down, and then the Spanish governor here in St. Augustine decided, okay, what are we going to do with all these runaways? And they decided, let's put them, in one place. Originally, they said this place that they were stationed at was an old Indian village. So they put them here in the old Indian village. And then someone had a great idea, let's just put some walls up, and it would actually be a first line of defense for St. Augustine. So when they actually decided it was a good idea to actually keep the runaways that was coming down, because the Carolinas wanted them back. They was like, hey, you know what? We want our slaves back. And they was like, nah, we think we're going to keep them because we can put them in a fort, and everybody's happy. We get use out of them, and they weren't too happy with the British at that time anyway. So I think they was kind of happy to do anything to irritate them.
The Underground Railroad actually came south long before it went north up into Canada and up into New England. Those freedom seekers who came down here to St. Augustine, to Spanish Florida, could live free. And that was one of the main reasons they were looking to come south to Spanish Florida. So in a sense, freedom was south long before it went north.
When the people arrived here from the plantations in the Carolinas, they were obligated to become Catholic in order to gain freedom, to be emancipated. It was a religious sanctuary, is the way the Spaniards looked at it. And there doesn't seem to be any indication at all that this was problematical or distasteful to any of the people of Mose. They had their children baptized in the church, their records are there, they had godparents, and so from every outward appearance, they fully embraced the notion of religious conversion. Now, whether they thought that, we don't know, but we didn't, for example, find any kind of material culture that would suggest one of the syncretic religions that you see so often in Latin America, where Catholicism is blended with a non-Christian tradition. We didn't see that at all at Mose, but that doesn't mean people weren't thinking.
The black residents of Fort Mose were not a monolithic group. The population consisted of people from many different African tribes.
Africa is a huge place, and the people who came to Fort Mose were from all over West Africa. If you think about the size of that continent compared to, say, the U.S., you know, you're talking about a lot of cultural diversity because of the geographic spread. So I can only imagine what it would have been like to hear the languages being spoken, learn about the different cultural practices, and yet people were here blending in with the Spanish traditions as well. So it's definitely a very multicultural, international community.
Francisco Menendez escaped slavery to begin a new life in Florida. His military skill and bravery defending St. Augustine from attack led to his being named head of the militia at Fort Mose.
The leader of the group at Fort Mose and the head of the militia, Francisco Menendez, has to be one of the most interesting people and colorful people in Florida history, maybe even American history. He was a Mandingo. He came to the Carolinas probably as a youth and escaped slavery. He allied with the Yamasee Indians in their fight against the English, at the Yamasee War, came with the Yamasee to Florida, went through several series of being betrayed and sold into slavery and escaping. He was a corsair. He was apparently a well-educated person. He could write and did write, and his story is really remarkable. You wouldn't really believe it if you saw it in a movie. You would think it was invented.
By 1738, the British threat to the north with the founding of Georgia had moved much closer to St. Augustine. So the threat was now along the St. Mary's River. So the governor was in the process of beefing up the defenses of St. Augustine by establishing a series of defensive lines. So Fort Mose was going to become the northernmost defensive line.
As part of the War of Jenkins' Ear between Spain and Great Britain, General James Oglethorpe led an invading force into Spanish Florida. In the early morning of June 26, 1740, that invasion was repelled at Fort Mose.
By late 1739, the governor of Georgia, General Oglethorpe, is planning and has already basically started approaching St. Augustine, coming from the west and capturing the various Spanish forts to the west here. And they were also beginning to move down from the north. But then the bulk of his troops were beginning to come by ship. And the troops, of course, consisted of the Carolina Rangers, Oglethorpe's own 42nd, and then their Native American allies, the Creek and the Cherokee. So by late 1739, they're beginning to approach St. Augustine. By the summer, early summer of 1740, they're actually in close proximity of St. Augustine.
Just before dawn, the black militia from Fort Mose, together with Spanish soldiers from St. Augustine and Yamasee Indian auxiliaries, launched an attack against the British, Scottish, and Native American forces under General Oglethorpe. What became known as the Bloody Battle of Fort Mose successfully ended Oglethorpe's siege of St. Augustine and returned control of Florida to the Spanish.
The fort itself, it was destroyed during the siege of 1740, and it wasn't until 12 years later that the second Mose was basically built, and that lasted for maybe approximately 11 years until Great Britain took over Florida from the Spanish in 1763. After Spain came back in 1783, there really was no effort to rebuild a fortification out here.
When Florida was ceded to England in exchange for Havana after the end of the 7 Years' War, all of the residents of St. Augustine left rather than stay and live with the Protestant English. And all of the people of Mose were among them. There were 86 people at Mose then, and they all went to Cuba, to the province of Matanzas, where some of them stayed, many of them left and moved back to Havana. But the records of their lives have been uncovered in Cuba, again by Jane Landers, who is learning their fate and if there might even be some descendants today.
Meticulous research of historical documents combined with the material discoveries at the Fort Mose archaeological site has produced a much more complete picture of what life was like for people of African descent in 18th century Florida.
There are times when I have thought the best thing that came out of the archaeology was the history. Because as part of the project, really before we begin, we always want to have a real historian search the records, do original research, so we just don't find out what they really already knew. And at that time, in really the 70s and early 80s, the thinking was that there's disenfranchised people, African Americans, slaves, women, children, poor people, didn't have a history. And the idea was it's up to the archaeologists to provide a history, words from the earth. But when Jane Landers, who was a graduate student working with me at the time, went to Spain to specifically look for information about the people of Mose, we were all astounded at the amount of detail there was and how much information there is. Sometimes you just have to ask the right question to find it. So the original research that came out of the project, I think, has been a major contribution to Florida history.
Today, visitors to Fort Mose Historic State Park can take a boardwalk through Florida's natural environment and look at where the fort once stood. Historic reenactments are performed frequently, and museum exhibits offer insights into an important aspect of Florida's colonial history.
Well, the story of Fort Mose is really important for all of American history, not just Florida. It provides, I think, a wide audience an alternate vision of what African American heritage in America is all about. It wasn't just a story of slavery and oppression. It was also this very successful story of resistance and flight and rebuilding a new place and a new time.
I was born and raised in St. Augustine, and it was an old wise tale that kind of a gossip that that we had a fort too, and I think about it, and at that time I thought, well, that may be something that the old timers are just telling us. So maybe we've got the Castillo downtown, but then we had a fort too. But when I went to college in Tallahassee at Florida A&M, the history professor asked us, each one of us, where we were from, and I told him I was from St. Augustine, Florida. And he said, well, have you ever heard of Fort Mose? And I said, well, no, sir, I haven't. So he said, when you come to my next class, you need to tell me something about Fort Mose, which I did, just to keep him off my back. But basically, when I found out about it, and I came across the reenactment and all of what was going on downtown, I realized there was an absence of the story of Fort Mose. So me and a couple of other folks decided that, with the help of the Park Service, Florida Park Service, that we were going to tell this story and just kind of continue to tell the story as long as we could, so that some of the kids growing up would know the story long before they find out in college.
The town of Eatonville, north of Orlando, is the first incorporated African-American municipality in the United States, but Fort Mose, north of St. Augustine, was the first legally sanctioned free black community in America. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
Florida's Space Coast Office of Tourism, representing destinations from Titusville to Cocoa Beach to Melbourne Beach. The Space Coast has a diverse 72 miles of beach, including surf towns and sea turtle nests. We have inspiring attractions, including the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, and the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. More information is available at www.visitspacecoast.com.
Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org.